So this number is true for Catholics, for Protestants, and Orthodox. Although with the Orthodox Christians, they may have some additional things, but with regards to these 27 books that we have in our Bible, practically Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians would have them. That is basically part of the canon that we have. Okay. So of these 27 New Testament writings, they are subdivided into the following literary genre. You have 4 Gospels, you have 1 Acts, and then you have 21 letters, and then 1 Apocalypse or Revelation. So majority of the documents that you find in the New Testament writings are letters. Many of them are from Paul, and the others are from the other leaders of the church in the earlier period. Now, regarding the Gospels, I will begin by introducing you to a definition by Michael Gorman what a gospel is, so that we basically have an understanding of what it takes for a document to be called a gospel. Because not all books that portray basically or tell us something about Jesus and his ministry and so on could be considered gospel. So according to Michael Gorman, these are generally the the necessary elements that should be present in what we can call gospel, a document that we can call a gospel. So his definition is it's an interpretative narrative of the appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and of the significance of that story for those who hear or read it. Okay, so that's how he defines it. So it's an interpretative narrative about the appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and of the significance of that story for those who hear or read it. In this definition, you can identify 3 elements. Can anyone guess what are those 3 elements that we could consider as part of the characteristic of what a gospel should be?
Ministry of Jesus.
Ministry of
Father,
Jesus.
the ministry.
Yes, that's one, basically, one of the contents that you can find in the text. What would be the 3 elements?
It's passion, I think.
Passion, but it's not in the definition.
Resurrection.
Resurrection.
Those who hear
Ministry of Jesus, Father.
Father.
Sorry?
Those who hear or read.
Ministry of Jesus.
Okay, one at a time. So those who hear and read it. And what was the other one?
Ministerial function of Jesus, Father.
Ministerial function of Jesus. So yeah, you're only telling me 1. I'm asking for 3.
Preaching, Father.
Preaching.
Yes.
Of course, it's part of the ministry, but it's not explicitated here, but it's part of it.
Miracles of Jesus, Father.
What is that?
Miracles of Jesus.
Miracles of Jesus. So I would like you to focus on we're looking at the definition offered by Michael Gorman, the one in front of you. So many of those that you're mentioning are part of it, I understand. But on the basis of this definition, what are the 3 elements that are important in this definition?
It's an interpretative narrative.
Ministry.
And what is that? Oh, don't hesitate. I'm asking you to just guess, because if you don't know it, then you just guess.
It's an interpretative narrative, Father.
Is that counted as 2 or just 1?
I think, Father, the three elements are the narrative, the significance of the story, and those who hear.
Uh,
So the narrative, the significance of the story, and those who hear. Any other suggestion?
Father, the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. You don't want to include appearance because that will make it full. That will make it full.
Father, I would like to answer. For me, it's number one, it's a narrative interpretation. And number two, the life of Jesus. And number three is the significance of the life of Jesus to the one who hears it.
Okay. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, those are the three important things. So interpretative narrative, that's one. Interpretative narrative, that's one. And then of course the contents of the story is basically about appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that means that's the basic criterion. So for a gospel to be called a gospel, it has to contain at least those four aspects of his life: appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection. If there is one lacking, then that makes that document not a gospel. Okay, that's the whole understanding with the contents. But there could be more, but not less than appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection. Now, the appearance could be by birth, the appearance could be by just the inauguration of ministry and so on. But at least he should begin his ministry at some point. So that's why your appearance is important, then the whole ministry, then the death that basically came towards the end, and then the resurrection that basically confirmed his authority and the meaning and gave meaning to everything. And then of course the third one has something to do with how does that affect those who will read and hear it. So the last part, the significance of that story for those who hear or read it, basically addresses the concern of us who reads them and hears them, and then how basically it affects in our life. So for a gospel to be a gospel, it has to basically have these three elements. So that's why here in the definition, you can see the difference. So the three elements are here. So the interpretative narrative, and then the blue one are the contents, and then the other another red color is basically towards the end, is basically for those who are using them, for those of us who read them, for those of us who hear them. Now, the next question that is important, of course, we understand that the content has something to do with the life of Jesus. But I've mentioned that these four at least should be there. If there is anything lacking out of these four, then that disqualifies it. The document may not be considered a gospel. As I've said, you can have more, but not less than these items in the ministry of Jesus. And then, of course, the significance of this particular document for those it was intended and for those who eventually make use of them and consider them important. Now, the question that I would like to follow up is what is the meaning of interpretative narrative? Narrative here is just generally a term for story. Basically, what we have in the gospel is a story about Jesus and, of course, the disciples and so on. But what does that mean when we say interpretative narrative? Anyone?
Father,
Yes.
Father, the story of Jesus was narrated based on the interpretation of the writer.
Hmm. Okay, that's correct. So that means each of the gospels that were written is from the perspective and the interest of the one who wrote it. So they're all practically talking about the life of Jesus, but it is basically from a certain lens, from a certain perspective. That's the reason why eventually in the history of the church, instead of just having one gospel, we are happy to have at least four to make us realize that no one can have a monopoly of an interpretation of the life of Jesus and how basically it is significant to those who are his disciples and so on. So at the same time, it also tells us that any believer who accepts the Bible as part of his or her resources is also basically allowed to interpret according to your experiences and faith. So that means even if we are not on the same page with regards to our interpretation, I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that our experiences sometimes are different. But it has nothing to do with one is wrong and the other one is correct. So there is no question about it, especially if you're reflecting on the text on the basis of your belief, of your faith. So that's why one interpretation could not actually be considered the interpretation. So that's why we can go on arguing with one another what passage would mean for one and the other, but there is no assurance that one could be absolutely correct and the other one would not be. Of course, unless the person is really saying something that is not according to what is written in the text. But otherwise, that's generally the whole idea of how we basically interpret the text. So it gives us an idea. Imagine if we have just one gospel, then we are just stuck with one way of reading the story of Jesus. But when we go to basically the individual gospels, we will realize that there could be many ways to actually read the life of Jesus, depending on what needs to be addressed in our life. And we realize that when we go, as I've said, into the individual gospels later on. So again, the important elements here is that we have to realize that the gospel is all about Jesus, particularly his appearance, ministry, death, and resurrection. But it is written from the vantage point of the narrator or the author or the evangelist, and also basically the interpretation was intended so that the way it is written could be significant for those for the original audience and for those people for whom this was intended, as well as for readers in our time, even up to the present time. So what that basically is generally what the gospel is. Now, regarding the stages of formation of the gospel, there are sometimes they would say four and sometimes three stages that the gospel went through in terms of its formation. Basically, from the time that we talk about Jesus until the time that they were able to put them into writing, it went through some stages. And I will introduce you to basically these two or these three or four stages. But of course, there's not really that much big difference in the way it is numbered. The one in blue is coming from the introduction to the New Testament by Raymond Brown. The one in black is basically from this article of Michael Gorman. Now, here in this particular stages, you see that the first stage was the words and deeds of Jesus. So this was basically what was happening when Jesus was here. So it's roughly dated between the late 20s to the early 30s. According to Raymond Brown, he's a Catholic biblical scholar. He said he refers to it as the public ministry or the activity of Jesus. Now, the second stage is oral transmission. From the time that it happened, so the apostles and the disciples and all those who got to know them started transmitting them, sharing them, and preaching them about them. So at least in a formal context. So between 30s to the 60s and even beyond, that was what was happening. They were spreading the stories that they learned about Jesus. Of course, there was no system in doing it. They were just trying to share basically their experience about the person of Jesus in the process. But according to Raymond Brown, in his second stage, it is the apostolic preaching about Jesus. Of course, that's the more formal way of doing it when you try to spread the story about Jesus in the context of apostolic preaching. But the oral transmission could be in different contexts. Then the third one is the early written sources. So maybe from the 40s and beyond. what is this? What are these early written sources? So before the gospel was written, there were probably written materials about different aspects of the life of Jesus. Like some scholars would say that there was an early collection of the passion narrative of Jesus, the story about his passion. Also, there could be like a collection of writings about the birth narratives of Jesus, or the sayings of Jesus, or a collection of the miracles that Jesus has done. So there may be so many of them. So this could be possible written sources in the early stages. But unfortunately, we do not have extant copies. That's why we cannot really ascertain whether there were really written sources. So that's the reason. That's the reason probably why for Raymond Brown, he immediately went to the written gospels on the third stage, because for him, because there is no evidence of a written document that talks about the early written sources, no matter how small they were. But since we don't have extant documents, there is no way for us to ascertain whether that was really the case. It is just basically presumed or hypothetically put together that the possibility of having those sources. Then those who basically suppose the four stages would only consider the writing of the canonical gospels as the last stage. But in the context of Father Raymond Brown, it is basically just three: so public ministry of Jesus, the apostolic preaching about Jesus, and the written gospels. And if you notice, with Father Raymond Brown, his third stage is the writing of the gospels. But for Gorman and the like and the other scholars would try to separate or distinguish between the writing of the gospels themselves and the sources before that. That there may be some early written sources about these different types of the stories of Jesus. So that's generally what they understood it to be. When we study when we go into the synoptic gospels, we will be able to study in much detail the stages of the formation of the gospel. But for now, suffice it to say that generally these were the stages. So it tells you that before the actual gospel were written, in this between the 60s to the 90s, it was already been passed on and transmitted and written about, although in not in a complete way, in the way that we see in the gospel. Uh, well, so basically, it was already being spread out and written about and talked about before they were actually put into writing. That's why the first thing that it would come to mind is how much of the actual words and deeds of Jesus was maintained up to the time that they were put into writing. So there could be some changes here, and hopefully there could be some consistency depending on the contents, on the elements that we are talking about in terms of the life and ministry of Jesus. So that's as far as the stages of the formation of the gospel. Okay. Now, one of the things that we notice in the four gospels is that the first three, the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, seems to be similar in the way it is written. That's why even if you read them basically individually, it's almost like easy to think that the first three gospels were writing more practically in the same way and maybe writing the details in the same sequence and so on. Because at first glance, our first observation is just they're practically the same. But sometimes when you hear a particular passage, you immediately say, I know that story. But we don't even bother to check whether what the story that is being used is coming from either Matthew or Mark or Luke. That's basically what is needed to be studied. That's why in the portion, the Synoptic Gospels, that will be something that will be studied in depth. Of course, the fourth Gospel is totally different in style. That's why it's not identifiable with the first three Gospels. Now, regarding these first three Gospels, of course, we see an obvious similarity among them in terms of the narrative, in terms of the story, and generally in terms of the contents. But yet at the same time, if you go closer, if you study them closer, you will realize that they are not actually the same. There are definitely a lot of differences that you can find. They may use the same story, but sometimes you will be surprised to find out that these different evangelists will use them at different points in the history, in the story of Jesus, and for different purposes. So they have different intentions with regards to that one. That's why one of the ways to study the first three Gospels, so these are what is considered as the synoptic Gospels, because you can study them together by identifying their similarities and differences. So to that question of how to explain the similarities and differences in the first three Gospels, they come up with so many suggestions and so many proposals and so on. But today, as in the scholarship today, majority of the scholars are still confident with this explanation, what we call the two source or the four source theory. So far, this is the best explanation they could think of in terms of explaining the similarities and differences of the first three Gospels. So this is not the final, what we call this, decision and on the matter, because nobody can be certain about it. But so far, this is one theory that could explain more of the problems or the peculiarity that we see in these three Gospels. So what is this two source and four source theory? So as I've said, it is to explain the similarities and differences of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So in this two source and four source theory, so they begin by asking the question, if these three are similar, the first thing that they would actually ask is, who copied from whom? Or among these three, which came first? In many of the discussions, some suggested Mark, some suggested Matthew. Maybe I don't know if there was one who suggested Luke, but at least Matthew was a strong contender for the position vis-a-vis Mark. So that's the first thing that they have to decide. So, but eventually, the textual critics came up with a decision and came up with some guidelines and maybe like criteria to be able to determine that if between Mark and Matthew, basically Matthew being the second best candidate for the position of the older among the three, so they basically come up with solutions like saying that Mark is the first, and then of course some people are saying Matthew is the first. But today, majority of the scholars would believe that among the three Gospels, it is Mark basically that is the first. So that means Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. So the first, one of the strong, what you call this, reason why they think so, because of the suggestion of textual critics, the one who study the texts, that one of their principles in understanding whether a variant text or a phrase in the text is older than and then the alternative, one of the important principle is that the longer it is, the later it is, and the shorter it is, the older it is. For the simple reason that it is easier to explain why a short text becomes long than a long text becoming short. So that means among these three Gospels, Mark has 16 chapters, Matthew has 28, Luke has 24. So if you notice, Matthew and Luke practically has double the chapters that you find in Mark. So definitely they are both longer than the Gospel of Mark. So on that basis of that principle, they think that I think Mark is the more older, is older than Matthew and Luke for the simple reason that it is easier to explain why Matthew and Luke has longer versions than Mark, because it could just basically be said that Matthew and Luke found that Mark's gospel is lacking with so many aspects of it. That's why they added some into it. Because if the case is different, like if Matthew is the first and Mark copied from Matthew, and then difference in terms of Gospels is that practically Mark is half of Matthew. So the question would rise now, what is the problem with Mark? Why he cut into half the Gospel of Matthew if he copied from it? Do you get the point? So there is a great explaining that Mark will have to do if Matthew is the older and he copied from it. So what is his problem? Why did he took away a lot of materials out of Matthew? While if the arrangement is this, that Mark is the first, it is easier to actually explain why Matthew and Luke are longer in terms of length, in terms of contents. Because you could just say that Matthew and Luke had added something into Mark that previously Mark didn't have. And I think the scholars were able to identify it. Because most of you, what you find in Mark are the story of Jesus, especially about the miracles and the things that he has done in his ministry and so on. But the majority of the things that have been added to Mark by Matthew and Luke in their Gospels are the sayings of Jesus. So the sayings of Jesus are not present that much in Mark, but they are present in Matthew and Luke. Now, because of that, it begs basically another question. So if Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, and yet they have more elements like sayings of Jesus that does not come from Mark, where did they copy? Where did they copy it? So, because you find them both in Matthew and Luke. So for that, the scholars basically came up with a suggestion that maybe Matthew and Luke had a common source that provide them with the details about the sayings of Jesus. Unfortunately, we don't have an extant copy. We don't have a copy of that source that they have. So to be able to just explain basically this whole problem, so scholars came up with a hypothetical source. So they just presume that Matthew and Luke may have copied from a source. Now, for a lack of a better name, that source that we're talking about here is called Q, which stands for Quelle. German word for Quelle is a German word for source. So it just means source. So for a lack of a better name. So here, basically, you talk about the two-source theory. That means the similarities that you find in the Synoptic Gospels has something to do with the fact that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. And then, of course, what is lacking in Mark, Matthew and Luke sourced it from Quelle, from the Q source. So that's generally the reason behind it. So that's why if you notice, all of the arrows are only basically one direction. And if you notice, there is no arrow between Matthew and Luke because it is believed that Matthew and Luke, the evangelists behind Matthew and Luke, did not know each other. They did not copy from one another. Because otherwise, if they copied from each other, they could have practically almost similar or identical text. But still, there are still elements that are not common between Matthew and Luke. So this is basically the two-source theory to explain the similarities and differences that we find in these three Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So it is basically sourced from Mark and as well as from Q, or the Q source, which is Quelle, for a German word which just means source as well. Now, the four-source theory is that they actually added up some explanation into it by saying that in this context, they were able to identify that it's true that Matthew and Luke would share elements with each other that could be traced back to Mark. But they also have a commonality between Matthew and Luke that could be traced back to Q, like the sayings of Jesus. But upon scrutiny, Matthew has text that only belongs to him. And Luke has text that is only found in Luke. So that's why it made the scholars to, again, propose that maybe Matthew has his own source and they just call it M. M source for Matthew. And Luke as well has his own source, which is L. That's why this became basically the four source theory, to just basically complete the study of the similarities and differences of these gospels. So now Matthew copied from Mark, Q, and M. Luke, for his part, copied from Mark, Q, and L. So the M and the L sources are basically parts of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that only are found in their own Gospels. Do you have any idea what are those passages? Do you have any idea that you can only find in Matthew? An example? Can you give an example?
The Good
Or-
Samaritan. The Good Samaritan and Luke, because Gospel.
In Luke, yes. The Good Samaritan in Luke. That's the only place where you can find that story. So that's why if you're asked where the story of the Good Samaritan is, don't go anywhere because you can not find it anywhere but except in Luke. Okay, what else? In Matthew, do you have an example in Matthew?
The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew.
But there is also a genealogy in Luke. There is just a difference, but there's also genealogy in Luke. What passage that it doesn't appear in either Mark or Luke for Matthew? Any guess? One story is the flight to Egypt that is only found in Matthew. And of course, there's still some other passages, but the point is that Matthew has materials that only he knows about, and as well as Luke has materials that only Luke knows about. That's precisely the reality regarding this synoptics that we have. Okay, is that clear? So we're just basically introducing you into these different aspects of the Gospels. So some basic information on the four Gospels. So among the four Gospels, so it is already presumed that Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels. So it is placed before or after 70 CE or AD. Then Matthew and Luke more or less are contemporary, 70s or 80s. Luke would be earlier, as according to some scholars, but John would always be the last of the four. So around 95 to even 100 or 110. So just imagine that the first gospel written is before or after 70 CE, but most probably between 60 and 70. And to think that the letters of Paul were actually written even before any of these gospels were written. So that's why Paul is familiar with the traditions about Jesus, but as far as written documents is concerned, the earliest, the letters of Paul, particularly his first letters, are the earliest document in the New Testament. So that's something that actually to think about. But anyway, we will go into the details of this text as we go on. Okay, so I will not just go into some of those details. You just have to read it later on when you're able to get a copy. So I will just basically stop here.